All right, hi everyone. Tinas has already introduced me, so I'm just going to jump straight into it. We essentially wanted to take some of these devices from online marketplaces and see how far we could get from a completely black box perspective. Now, it's very interesting to note that in the past it was much harder to gain access to these devices, but again now you can just get them from these online marketplaces to the point where even students from Hungary are just buying these devices to look at them. Now, you see these devices all over the country. We have them in petrol stations, pharmacies, I've even seen some at toll gates. And the security for these devices can vary. We've seen ones that 3 weeks in, I don't really have a lot to tell you. We've seen ones where, like Tinas mentioned, a day or two in, I can already tell you what the biggest problems are on these devices. One of the difficult questions to answer is who's fundamentally responsible here? You have the manufacturers who build the devices, and if they introduce vulnerabilities, everyone else in the chain suffers. Then you have merchants who take these devices and resell them, and a similar thing happens there where if you happen to get a merchant who's not particularly security conscious and you buy one of these devices, your organization could suffer. Before we attack something, we really need to understand what it looks like and how it works. So, armchair science level, we have a payment gateway and we have what's known as a TMS. The payment gateway is used to authorize transactions, and the TMS is used for your day-to-day maintenance of the device. Things like pushing application updates and so forth. Any good research starts with a review of what's already available online. Now, this particular CVE targets a device that we happen to know are used by 2 of our clients. And what it comes down to is that 2 separate security researchers managed to find OS command injection in the same piece of software in the same place that essentially gave an attacker access to a root shell. And you'll see there at the end it says the attacker must have a shell to access the device in order to exploit this vulnerability. This is a bit of a misnomer. There's no such thing as shell access on this device. If you have physical access to the device, you have shell access to the device. Now we're going to look at some Discord messages here from a server where people were actively investigating these devices. This is the Hungarian students. I would argue that these are just people with a healthy curiosity, not necessarily threat actors. Although it will look bad if they do happen to find something on one of your devices. This is what I would call a dangerous hobbyist. This person came in one day, said they wanted to unlock one of these devices, and the next day I was checking my phone. He's like, I managed to do it. Now I'm looking to root one of these devices. That's one day. The last one there is arguably the only real threat actor. This person is saying you don't need to unlock the device, you don't need to root the device, just send me a message, pay me a little bit of money, and we'll use our small automatic tool, is what I think that says, to do this for you. Now, unfortunately, this person never came back to me, so I don't know whether or not this is someone who's actually scamming users of this Discord server, or whether or not it's someone who does have the ability to do this, maybe something like a malicious insider. This is just to show you that this isn't a coincidence. We've seen this for a lot of these devices. A Telegram channel where we found this video. It's a point-of-sale device. You can't really see it because otherwise that would give away the branding and what device this is, but you can see that there's a game on this device. Now I want to introduce you to Mike Wynn. And there's really one thing that Mike and myself have in common. At the end of the day, Mike's hairline has finished receding. So he is important and we're going to talk about him again later, but just keep him in the back of your head for now. So the TMS system is the first thing that you see here, the first thing that an attacker is likely to look at just because of the kind of data that it works with. What we were able to do is use a trivial authorization bypass. I can never say that in a report, but I've got a little bit more creative freedom here, to essentially gain access to 100 unique applications from one device manufacturer and 70 unique applications from another device manufacturer. I suspect this is a problem all across the industry, and we'll get to why this was so trivial and easy to do in a little bit. The next thing that if you're a mobile pen tester, you work with mobile devices, you know that USB debugging is your bread and butter. We really can't do much without it. It's our way to interact with applications on the device, install new applications to the device, and so forth. Now what we have here is a Future Tech Ltd device. All of this is completely made up. And a Sand and Bricks Co. merchant, right? Now for this device, we weren't able to get USB debugging on the device, which means we're dead in the water. The merchant essentially did everything that they could to secure this device. Unfortunately, another merchant called Cape Town Fish and Chips, who just happened to use the same device, didn't take the same amount of care. So we could use this to get USB debugging on their devices, which would allow us to use these debug devices as a mechanism to still be able to make payments. So a really cheap and dirty thing you can do here is just always charge triple the amount that you're actually displaying to the user, or build something like a card skimmer. Unfortunately, we can combine this with the previous vulnerability, and even though Sandenbrick's code did everything right, they are now collateral damage because of another merchant, a competitor potentially even, not doing their own security properly. So just as a quick recap, I hope I've convinced you that people are actively investigating these devices, and it's because they see them for what they can be, which is really low effort but high value targets. Even if yours is secure, your competitors might not be, and again, that does put you at risk. If your device manufacturer themselves are not secure, that's even worse. This is an open invite. If you have one of these devices, please come chat to me afterwards. I'd love to hear about some of the challenges that you're facing, how we can help. We've done testing on the point-of-sale systems themselves, the payment gateways, as well as Postillion. We've seen all these things, but never really done a full end-to-end assessment to see what can we really do all the way through. So as a high-level overview of what we did during this research, the devices delivered to me. The first thing I tried to do was to do a man-in-the-middle attack. Surprisingly, this works for a lot of these devices. After we have that, we try to get USB debugging. Again, pen test is bread and butter. We want to pull the applications. We want to run some static test cases, some dynamic test cases, and just see how far into this device we can get. I do want to say that for none of the devices here did we do an exhaustive review. I think there's a lot of space for more research, especially on the physical side. For example, the NFC scanner, the swipe to pay, and those kinds of things. We didn't really look at that. And even on the software side, you could probably look at these devices for months and still find things. So the findings that we had within the first few days were so convoluted that we ended up needing a map. And this is what that looked like. So this is because everything was very closely related, which, like I've shown you with compromising the one merchant, and we're able to use that to essentially compromise another merchant. Now, the first thing we want to do once we have the devices is to try and get out of what's known as a kiosk mode. So if you've ever been to an electronics store, you know what a kiosk mode looks like. The idea is it's just restricting the device to its original intended use. So a TV, for example, will just let you watch the rugby. For some of these devices, you can just straight go into the settings menu and enable USB debugging, and that's the end of that. For others, you can try going into the Wi-Fi settings and using the back button. Sometimes that will take you to the system settings, which you can then use to enable USB debugging. It's the same thing with the volume buttons on the device. You can increase the volume, decrease the volume, and then try the back button again to get back into the systems menu and then enable USB debugging. The next three mechanisms aren't really that useful, at least not in the research. The first one is an SD card. If you plug that into any Android device, you can use the File Explorer to see what's going on. You can try to open some log files if there are any on the SD card, or you can even try and install applications if the particular device allows that kind of thing. A captive portal, the concept is very similar. We're trying to engage with other components on the device by abusing just everyday functionalities of the device. So in this case, if you use a captive portal, it will redirect all HTTP traffic to an attacker-controlled server, which we can use to present the user with a web view that we can then use to potentially pull malicious APKs or try to interact with other applications that expose browsable intents, for example. Then we have an HID device, that's a human interface device, a keyboard or mouse, and screen copy --OTG mode. So this was really useful for the next slide. For one of these devices, the manufacturer had a hidden button, completely invisible, that you would have to tap a number of times to actually enable USB debugging mode. And one easy way to find these buttons is to just plug in a keyboard to the device and essentially abuse the accessibility settings by tapping the tab key so that it will helpfully highlight all of the different elements for you. I was running around the office with a point-of-sale system and a keyboard, look at this! So the other thing that we saw was that after we had gotten into the device settings menu, we needed to enable USB debugging. Now, in most cases, this screen is protected by either a static pin or a derived pin. So you can think of the serial number and the date, for example. These aren't effective controls because they're values that the attacker has control, or that the attacker also knows. And by virtue of that, they can use this to enable USB debugging. The next problem that we had was you need to actually accept USB authorization when you want to use USB debugging. And this particular device had a payment screen that would constantly overlay that actual menu, which means we couldn't tap yes quick enough to just allow us access to the device. An easy workaround for this was to reboot the device, continuously spam USB debugging, and then we'd have a window of about 1 to 2 seconds or so where we could just tap yes quick enough before the payment application takes over. Now, we work backwards, and what I mean by that is if I ask to do one of these assessments for you, I'll typically say, give me a production device and give me a debug device. I'll take the production device and sit with the manufacturer to go through what this looks like to take the production device and enable the USB debugging mode. Once I understand what the happy flow looks like, I'll try to reproduce that on the device that has debugging enabled. And this really allows us to do things that would normally only be possible in 30 days within 15 days. So for one of the devices, to my great dismay, we couldn't actually enable USB debugging and I couldn't figure out how this pin process works. So I did what any good pen tester does, and I lied. I sent a mail telling them that my developers need to build some kind of payment functionality. It really was that vague. And the manufacturer came back and just said, here's a code. And that allowed me to enable USB debugging on the device. What's interesting is this particular manufacturer had a payment series of devices as well as a normal series of devices. And they're very holy about the payment series of devices. So all of these devices also have a mechanism to remotely control them. You can see the screen, you can interact with the screen. It's like using the device, but from a web browser at the end of the day. And while they wouldn't give me access to the remote control functionality, they were more than happy to give me access to the USB debugging functionality, which at least from a risk perspective is strange, to say the least. So let's talk a bit about Mike Wynn. Does anyone want to guess who he is? And the only hint I'll give you is that he once renewed his passport without an appointment with the Department of Home Affairs. So if you haven't seen him, he's in the top right there. He is what I would call a government template. And what makes this particularly frightening is we were able to use this ID straight from Google Images, copied it, and complete a KYC process, a Know Your Customer journey. So what the merchant wasn't doing in this case is to, at the very least, compare whether or not the ID number that we have from the scan document matches the ID number that was filled into the web form. Worse than that, if we just go back, sorry I skipped ahead a bit, you'll see that the surname, the name, the ID number, the signature, everything on this just screams danger, right? So that was really scary to see. Now let's talk about the terminal management systems in a bit more depth. They're very similar to mobile device management systems. You can use them to wipe the device, update the firmware, push software to the device. You can get like geolocation data and things like that. So there are three things you want to consider when you look at your TMS. The first is whether or not the host itself is safe. If you compromise the host, so for example, if someone embedded credentials for the TMS inside of the device, that allows attackers to essentially execute any action on this device, but it's worse because it's not merchant specific, this is manufacturer specific, because these systems tend to be multi-tenancy. Then we want to look at whether or not the transport channel is safe. Because you're pushing things like credentials, Wi-Fi credentials, APN credentials over this channel, as well as instructions to execute, if I can man in the middle of that channel, I can change those credentials, change those instructions, and you really don't want that to happen. The next thing is the client-side security controls. So these are typically things like remote lock and unlock, and they're used as fraud preventative measures. So if you lose a device, you want to lock the device so that someone can't physically go and tamper with the device. So how do you authenticate with a device that leaves your premises, may or may not be running your version of the software, and can be purchased by Hungarian students online? So the first thing that comes to mind for me is using a private key and certificate. That way, device 1001 can attest to the TMS that it is in fact device 1001, and it cannot attest to the fact that it is device 1002. It turns out this isn't as common. Instead, we've seen three different types of authentication. The serial number, and my personal favorite, an AES encrypted serial number. It's ridiculous that we have to fight about these kinds of things. So now we have to look at the concept of application stores. The TMS and the application store go hand in hand. Because you're installing software to the device, you typically have a store where this happens, and all of these devices have a store. However, all of these stores are private, which have some pretty important security implications. So the Google App Store does screening for vulnerabilities like embedded credentials, certificate chain validation, and what I would call a unicorn vulnerability called the debuggable flag. So if you've done something like mobile training at any point, this is one of the first things that you see. If an application is marked as debuggable, the implication is that any other application on that device can control the execution flow of the target app that's marked as debuggable. And believe it or not, we managed to purchase a device online that actually has a process that's marked as debuggable. The reason that's interesting and why I say it's a unicorn finding is that I've never actually seen this on any client application that goes through the Play Store because it's fundamentally impossible. In the public Play Store, you cannot push an application that has the debuggable flag set to true. But remember, we're not playing by those rules. We're using private application stores, so the applications aren't as carefully looked at. So we're back to this slide. I've kind of already said how this works. Because the devices authenticate to the TMS using a serial number, we could enumerate the serial number to just pull unique applications for these different devices. Now, on the left-hand side here, you'll see an example of a Python script that we use to dump these applications that has a custom cryptography implementation, so requests to this API have to be encrypted and signed. Now, you'll see that's a little over 30 lines of code. It's very little. On the right-hand side, we had another manufacturer which didn't need this kind of crypto, and again, it's just 30 less lines of code. So my question to you is whether or not you think this kind of mitigation can really serve as any kind of effective security control. I don't see any yeses or nos, but personally, I hate this. I don't think anything like this provides security value other than forcing attackers to spend more time before they can actually interact with your systems. It also has the negative side effect that someone like myself who enjoys looking at these things, I will actively spend more time whenever I see this because it's a good indicator that something is wrong once we get beyond this point. So what are some of the apps that we saw? WhatsApp, Chrome, nothing to be too worried about. TeamViewer, it's a little bit concerning. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone just quickly log in with TeamViewer while you're doing a card payment, as well as AnyDesk. So this is a bit of a nightmare scenario, and as much as it's been a fun talk, I think this is where it takes a bit of a tragic turn. We had a test where these devices were talking to the TMS system and were talking to different message queues to essentially fetch these instructions for what they were supposed to do. Now, you'd think that they would use unique credentials per device. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We had duplicated credentials for every single device, which meant any device could impersonate any other device. At the same time, unfortunately, these queues were readable and writable if you managed to find this credential on the point of sale system. And the implication there is that I can go and send instructions to these devices to say do things like try to install this application, lock the device, wipe the firmware. As part of this test, I introduced a SQL injection payload, fully expecting it not to work. And the next morning when I woke up, I had a few callbacks to a server that we controlled, one of which came from an IP address associated with the US military. If we do get drone striked, I apologize. So let's move on to embedded credentials. So on one of these devices, we found back office credentials just sitting there, the username, the password, clear text. We could use this to actually log into the system, which we did very briefly, just to confirm that the credentials worked. Luckily, this wasn't the bank-specific credentials, but credentials belonging to a merchant that uses this back office application on the bank's network. We also have seen multiple instances too of AWS access keys and access secrets, as well as Alibaba access keys and access secrets just being embedded into these devices. This slide doubles for that because it literally used AWS access key, even though it was Alibaba access keys. Then this comes from the nightmare scenario where we found the queue username and password embedded in the device just as is, which allowed us to then use that to authenticate back to these queues. What's interesting here is this is a good point to make where embedded credentials isn't necessarily the problem here. It's a problem because it's the same credential for every single device, as well as that these credentials haven't been scoped correctly. So if it was a unique credential per device that only allowed me to read these instructions, then the attack's not feasible anymore. Next, we're going to move on to inter-process communication. So you typically have a higher privilege process that runs on this device that will do things like facilitate the remote lock and unlock functionality, the wipe functionality, as well as payments. Now, for none of the devices that I've tested have I ever seen a manufacturer actually do this properly. So what it comes down to is you know that a particular merchant is buying the device, which means you know that that merchant's application is going to be signed with their developer certificate. That means you can reject any connection to this higher privilege process purely because the signature for that process doesn't match what you're expecting. Now, unfortunately, as I've already alluded to, nobody really does this, and the implications of this is pretty far-reaching. The first is, if I, for example, steal a device and manage to get USB debugging access before a merchant notices the device has been stolen, they can go and they can contact the device manufacturer or log into the TMS, and they can block this device. They can say this shouldn't function anymore, and again, fraud preventative measure. Unfortunately for them, because I have ADB access now, I can just issue a command to unlock the device again. What's worse is that this also affects payments. So the previous example, we were able to take a device from one merchant that wasn't vulnerable and essentially make them vulnerable. This works because the manufacturer doesn't verify the signature of this IPC component. I'm just going to skip through these. You guys have seen these slides. Next, we're going to look at transport insecurity. So the idea is that when we send data over a network, we want that data to be protected, and we generally use TLS for that. So for the devices that we researched, we saw sensitive information being transmitted over clear text, as well as insufficient chain validation. This is a good point to just mention again, if these were public application stores, these types of vulnerabilities would probably be flagged before your application reaches production. So for the one device, this was a colleague who did this assessment. He got access to the settings menu of this payment device, and the first thing that he noticed was that it's talking to the payment processor over clear text. We've also seen the USB debugging authorization flow, OTA updates, application installs and updates over clear text, as well as supporting in-core APIs just being used over clear text. For this one, I need to set a little bit of a scene. You have a device, and you want your customer to pay by scanning a QR code. So you go on the device and you enter an amount, and you don't have to enter business, you just say 500 Rand. The customer scans the QR code, and just like that, I've made a payment to Mike's Noodles for 500 Rand. Now, if there are some pen testers in the room, I'm sure you already know where this is going with the JSON there on the screen. For some reason, they had two fields for everything that they were displaying. So an amount field for the actual amount, as well as a displayed amount for the amount that would be displayed to the end user. This is what this looked like on the payment device. So you see the QR code, you see that we're paying 500 Rand to Mike's Noodles, and you just scan it and make the payment. Because this was being done over a channel for which certificate chain validation wasn't being done, we could just change this to say that no, instead we want to pay 5,000 Rand, and we want to pay it to the Risk Accepted Trust Fund. If you look at the device, the payment device, what you end up seeing is that you're making a 500 Rand payment to Mike's Noodles. But if you scan that QR code, luckily, this is how it played out and not the other way around, on the customer device, you would see that no, instead the payment is actually going to the Risk Accepted Trust Fund, and that it's 5,000 Rand. The other implication of this is if you were an ISP or someone who is suitably positioned to do a man-in-the-middle attack on these devices, you'd be able to see the transactions as well as the amounts, where they're coming from and where they're going through for an entire network, so something like a SPARSA, for example. We're very briefly going to touch on Android file system encryption. So if you don't have a passphrase for your phone, please set one. If you're using a PIN, please consider using a passphrase. Really anything else, please consider using a passphrase. All the security for Android and iOS devices are essentially derived off of your, hopefully, passphrase. The implication, if you don't have one of these, is that it will use a known value to encrypt the file system, which means that if I get physical access to the device, I can do exfiltration of the data by just decrypting the file system with this known value. None of the devices that we researched had this kind of lock screen set. One did helpfully suggest that the user set one, though. Outdated software, this is my favorite slide out of the whole talk. So most of the devices that we've seen are running Android 11 or older, which is reached end of life in February 2024. Now, Meta's Red team found a vulnerability against a lot of Android devices, and if you're wondering why they were looking into Android devices, it's because they've got the Oculus, and they obviously have a vested interest in making sure that that device is safe. Now, this vulnerability is a privilege escalation and code execution vulnerability. It allows you to run in the context of any application on the device, so you can do anything that the app can, and I'll demonstrate that now by using it to steal my WireGuard VPN keys that I use for testing. The only thing you need to do this is to know the device unlock credential, but recall that none of these devices had an unlock credential, or you need a way to enable USB debugging. Okay, so this is how we get a reverse shell on the WireGuard application. So I'm going to run my script there. The device is listening, we connect back to that, we do a who am I. It might be a little bit hard to see in the back there, I do apologize. So now we know that we're running as the application. We can list the application's data directory. Even if you were running as the system user, which is a higher privileged user on Android, you could not do this because of how Android enforces SE Linux policies. So you have to be the target application to access the target application's private data directory. And just like that, we have managed to exfiltrate the WireGuard configuration file from the WireGuard process. Now, I want to make it clear here that if you have any kind of Android application, you are vulnerable to this if your users are using a vulnerable device. This will work on banking applications, it will work on payment applications, it works on any Android device, as long as it hasn't been updated since whenever that security patch was issued. I think it was February 2024. The next example is using the same vulnerability, but it's a little bit more complex. So we are going to force the application to spawn in a debuggable state. If you've ever worked with the Java wire debug protocol, then you know how finicky this protocol is, and you know that it is not the kind of thing you want to use to build a card skimmer or anything of that nature. So we're going to forward the JDWP port back to us. We're going to attach to it with the Java debug protocol. Then we're going to set a breakpoint on the one thing that's always called, which is java.lang.string.toString. Going to wait for that and wait for the breakpoint to trigger. And now you'll see if I tap the top right, the application pauses. At this point, we copy over a Frida gadget. We wait for that to finish. And as soon as it's finished, we can just load the gadget into the application's runtime. And now we should be able to see it as soon as that command is finished running. You can see there's a gadget there. Now we attach to the process. And at this point, again, we can do anything the application can. So I've hooked the java.lang.toString function, and I'm going to just display whatever that function is actually doing. And you'll see as soon as that happens, I'm just going to paste my Frida script in there. Now if I interact with the device at all, it'll just dump an obscene amount of information. And there are the private keys and public keys that I use for my WireGuard server when I'm doing testing. So 2 of the devices that we researched were vulnerable to this attack. If you have these devices, please go check if they do actually receive updates that are past February 2024. It's interesting to note that for one of the manufacturers, the one merchant claimed to be running the newest version of the software, let's say version 10.0.1, and the other merchant claimed to be running also the newest version of the software, 10.0.3. So it's very, very strange behaviors that we see on these devices. I think these key reflections are fairly straightforward. I've already really gone over them. But the critical thing that I want to get down here is that we can't, as individuals or as individual companies, secure these devices. It's not going to make a difference if there's 99% of the merchants doing something correctly, and there's that one merchant who doesn't do something correctly, or a manufacturer who just doesn't care. At the end of the day, we need a concentrated effort from all over the country to essentially make these devices secure. We need to insist that what we currently have is not good enough. Is it really okay if you think about your family members, maybe your spouse, maybe your children, using these devices and then them losing money because of it? And that's it. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it.